A Scandal in Sapphire and Silk, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there! Welcome back to Haunting Veils. Tonight's mystery begins with elegance, wealth, and a scandal someone was desperate to keep hidden. At a glamorous gathering filled with sapphire jewels and flowing silk gowns, a shocking incident turns an evening of luxury into something far more dangerous. Miss Marple quickly notices the tension behind the smiles, whispered conversations, nervous glances, and a missing piece of jewelry that may connect everyone in the room to a carefully buried secret. Because in St. Mary Mead, beauty and refinement often hide the darkest intentions. Before we uncover the truth behind the scandal in Sapphire and Silk, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Veils. Chapter 1. The Sapphire in the Silk Room. The first sign that something was wrong came long before the sapphire vanished. It came with the weather. Rain rolled across the countryside in heavy grey sheets, beating against the tall windows of Briarley Manor and turning the gardens outside into black pools of mud and shadow. The manor stood alone upon the hill, enormous and dark against the stormy sky, with narrow chimneys stretching upward like crooked fingers. Even from inside, the place carried a strange feeling about it, too quiet in some corners, too loud in others, the sort of house where secrets seem to settle into the walls and stay there for years. Inside the drawing-room, however, everything glittered. Crystal chandeliers burned warmly overhead, silver trays gleamed beneath the candlelight. Ladies drifted across thick carpets in silk gowns, while cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. A gramophone played soft dance music near the fireplace, though the sound crackled now and then beneath the growl of distant thunder. To most people, it looked like a perfectly respectable gathering. Miss Marple knew better almost immediately. She sat quietly beside the fire with her knitting resting in her lap, appearing entirely harmless. That was usually when people revealed the most about themselves. They ignored old women, they spoke too freely near them, they forgot they were being observed. And tonight everyone in the room seemed frightened of something. Colonel Hastings drank his whiskey far too quickly for a man trying to appear calm. His smile came late whenever someone spoke to him, and his fingers tapped constantly against the side of his glass. Mr. Lionel Graves, the family solicitor, kept wiping perspiration from his forehead, though the room itself was rather cold. Near the doorway stood Clara, one of the younger maids, holding a silver tea-tray with trembling hands and eyes fixed nervously toward the center of the room, toward the sapphire. The Carrington Sapphire rested inside a polished silver display case atop a small round table covered in pale white silk. It was larger than most people expected, deep blue beneath the chandelier light, with sharp cold flashes hidden inside the stone whenever someone moved nearby. It drew attention the way fire draws moths, and Lady Edith adored every second of it. She moved gracefully through the room in a shimmering silver gown, pausing every few minutes beside the sapphire so guests could admire both the jewel and its owner together. Her laughter carried too loudly across the room, and though she smiled constantly, there was strain beneath it, the kind of strain Miss Marple had seen before in people trying very hard not to fall apart. £40,000, Lady Edith announced proudly for perhaps the fourth time that evening, though I suspect it may be worth even more now. A few guests offered polite little laughs. Nobody sounded natural. Outside, wind scraped harshly against the old windows. Somewhere deeper in the manor, a door slammed with enough force to make several guests jump. One woman pressed her hand against her chest afterwards while nervously laughing at herself. "Ghastly weather," muttered Colonel Hastings. "Perfect weather for thieves," replied Lionel Graves quietly. The remark lingered in the room longer than anyone liked. Miss Marple glanced toward Clara again. The poor girl looked ready to faint altogether. Her face had gone terribly pale, and she nearly dropped the tea-tray when Lady Edith called sharply for more drinks. Interesting, very interesting. Servants became nervous for reasons ordinary guests rarely noticed. They saw things, heard things, passed silently through rooms while everyone else ignored them completely. Miss Marple had learned years ago that frightened servants often meant dangerous households. Dinner ended shortly after 9, though nobody seemed eager to leave the drawing-room afterwards. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, and thunder rolled low across the hills surrounding the manor. The gramophone continued its tired little tune, while guests gathered near the fire with fresh drinks and forced conversation. Then came the moment that changed everything. Clara crossed the room quietly, carrying a tray of coffee cups. As she passed Lady Edith, she leant down slightly and whispered something in her ear. Miss Marple did not catch every word, only the final part. "He knows about Harold." Lady Edith froze instantly. It lasted barely a second, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. Her smile vanished, color drained from her face, her hand tightened sharply around the stem of her wine-glass. Fear, not confusion, not anger, fear, real fear. Lady Edith quickly recovered herself and dismissed Clara with a sharp nod, but the damage had already been done. Across the room, Miss Marple watched carefully while questions began quietly forming in her mind. Who was Harold, and why had the mere mention of his name terrified Lady Edith more than the thought of losing a £40,000 jewel? The atmosphere inside the drawing-room changed after that. People spoke more softly. Colonel Hastings avoided looking toward Lady Edith altogether. Lionel Graves poured himself another drink with noticeably shaping hands. Outside, lightning flashed brightly across the windows. Then the lights went out. The drawing-room vanished into darkness. Someone gasped near the fireplace. A chair scraped violently across the floorboards. Glass shattered somewhere in the blackness. One woman pressed her hand against her chest afterwards while nervously laughing at herself. For 10 long seconds, Briarley Manor sat buried in darkness, except for flashes of lightning beyond the storm-covered windows. And during those 10 seconds, somebody moved. Miss Marple heard it. Soft footsteps, quick, careful, near the table where the sapphire rested. Then the lights returned. The chandelier flickered weakly overhead. Every face in the room turned toward the center table at once. The silver display case still sat upon the silk cloth beneath the lights, but the sapphire was gone. The case stood open and empty. Silence swallowed the room whole. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Lady Edith let out a terrible scream that echoed through Briarley Manor like the beginning of something far worse. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Silk. The scream seemed to linger in the manor long after Lady Edith fell silent. For several dreadful moments nobody moved at all. The guests simply stood frozen beneath the chandelier, staring at the empty silver display case as rain battered the windows behind them. The warmth seemed to drain straight out of the room. Even the gramophone had stopped spinning, leaving only the sound of the storm outside and the uneven breathing of frightened people. Then chaos arrived. Colonel Hastings demanded the doors be locked at once. One of the ladies began crying softly into her handkerchief, while another insisted the servants should all be searched immediately. Mr. Lionel Graves stepped toward the sapphire table, his face pale beneath the lights, though he stopped himself from touching the empty case. Lady Edith looked close to collapse. "My sapphire!" she whispered hoarsely. "My God, it's gone!" Miss Marple remained seated near the fireplace, watching. Panic had a curious way of revealing character. Some people became loud, others silent. Some lied too quickly, others avoided speaking at all. And tonight, everyone in the room appeared to be hiding something. The butler hurried to telephone the police, while servants nervously closed the manor doors. No one would be leaving Briarley Manor until the sapphire was found. That fact settled heavily over the guests like a second storm cloud. Miss Marple noticed Clara standing near the doorway, clutching her apron so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The poor girl looked terrified beyond reason. Not guilty, terrified. There was a difference. About 40 minutes later, Inspector Vale arrived through the front doors, dripping rainwater across the marble floor. He removed his coat slowly, glanced once around the drawing room, and immediately looked annoyed with everyone present. Miss Marple rather liked him for that. He was a tall man with tired eyes and a voice roughened by years of cigarettes and disappointment. Unlike most policemen, he didn't waste time trying to sound clever. "Right," he muttered. "Nobody leaves the house." No one argued. The questioning began almost immediately. Guests were interviewed one by one, while thunder rolled heavily above the manor roof. Inspector Vale moved carefully through each conversation, watching faces more than words. Colonel Hastings claimed he had been standing by the fireplace during the blackout. Unfortunately, 2 guests insisted they'd seen him near the sapphire moments earlier. The colonel became red-faced and defensive almost at once. Mr. Lionel Graves remained calmer, though sweat constantly rolled down the side of his face despite the cold room. He claimed the jewel meant nothing to him and suggested the thief was likely someone desperate enough to ruin themselves for money. Interesting choice of words. Lady Edith answered questions with dramatic exhaustion, pressing fingers to her temples and speaking as though she might faint at any moment. Yet Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Not once did Lady Edith ask whether the sapphire might be recovered. Not once. A woman who truly loved such a jewel would have been frantic, furious, desperate. Lady Edith seemed frightened of something else entirely. Then there was Harold. Inspector Vale eventually asked the question directly. Who exactly is Harold Turner? Silence filled the drawing room immediately. Colonel Hastings looked away toward the windows. Lionel Graves adjusted his collar again. Clara nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. And Lady Edith went completely still. The inspector noticed it too. "Well?" he asked sharply. "He was a groundskeeper here," Lady Edith answered after a pause. "Months ago. He left unexpectedly." "That all?" "Yes." But the lie hung heavily in the room. Miss Marple could almost see it. Because ordinary groundskeepers did not terrify wealthy women. Ordinary groundskeepers were not whispered about in panic moments before jewels vanished. No, Harold Turner was something far more dangerous. The questioning dragged well past midnight. Rain continued hammering the manor windows as the guests grew increasingly pale and exhausted. Servants carried untouched tea through the corridors, while Inspector Vale paced endlessly beside the fireplace.
Around 2 in the morning, people finally began drifting upstairs toward their rooms. Nobody wished to sleep, but remaining together in the drawing room had become unbearable. Miss Marple stayed awake. She sat quietly near the dying fire with her knitting in her lap while Inspector Vale reviewed his notes nearby. The manor had grown strangely silent now. Only the storm could be heard beyond the walls. Then came the scream. Sharp, terrified, human. It tore through the upper corridor so violently that everyone downstairs froze in place. Inspector Vale was first to move. He rushed toward the staircase while guests stumbled after him in confusion and fear. Servants emerged from corridors in dressing gowns and slippers, their faces pale beneath the flickering lights. The scream had come from the silk room, a long upstairs chamber where Lady Edith kept expensive gowns, jewelry, perfumes, and old family treasures locked behind glass cabinets. Clara stood trembling in the doorway. One shaking hand covered her mouth, the other pointed silently inside. The room smelled faintly of perfume and candle wax. Dresses of silk and velvet hung motionless beneath the soft golden lamps. One chair had been overturned near the far wall, and there, sprawled across the pale carpet beneath the hanging gowns, lay Mr. Lionel Graves, dead. His eyes stared blankly toward the ceiling. A silk cord had been pulled tightly around his throat, cutting deep into the skin. But that wasn't the worst part. Pinned directly to his chest with one of Lady Edith's silver brooches, glittering cold beneath the candlelight, was the missing sapphire.
Chapter 3. The Woman in Grey Silk. Death changes the feeling of a house. By morning, Briarley Manor no longer seemed grand or elegant. The chandeliers still glowed, the silver still shone, but none of it mattered now. Fear had settled over the manor like dust over a coffin. Curtains remained drawn against the grey morning sky, and every corridor carried the uneasy silence of people listening for footsteps. Nobody touched breakfast. The guests sat pale and exhausted around the dining-room table, while servants moved quietly between them, avoiding eye contact. Somewhere upstairs, police officers searched rooms and questioned staff in low, murmuring voices. And through it all, Lady Edith remained strangely calm. Too calm. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. The old lady sat near the window, stirring her tea slowly, while Inspector Vale paced beside the fireplace, reviewing his notes. Lionel Graves was dead. The sapphire had been found pinned to his body. On the surface, the matter appeared almost simple now. A theft, a quarrel, a murder. Case closed. But simple explanations often hide ugly truths underneath. Miss Marple glanced toward Lady Edith, who stared silently into the cold morning light beyond the curtains. Her silver gown from the night before had been replaced with a grey silk robe, though somehow she still looked as though she were performing for an audience. Interesting. People who grieved honestly rarely looked theatrical. Inspector Vale finally stopped pacing. "Graves stole the sapphire," he announced. "Someone caught him in the silk room, they fought, and he was strangled with the cord." Colonel Hastings nodded too quickly. One of the guests quietly agreed. But Miss Marple spoke before the matter could settle. "No," she said softly, "that isn't what happened at all." The room fell silent. Inspector Vale turned toward her with tired eyes. "You've noticed something?" "Oh, yes, several things, actually." Lady Edith's fingers tightened around her teacup. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her lap before continuing. The strangest thing was not the sapphire disappearing. It was Lady Edith herself. Everyone looked toward her. A woman deeply attached to such a valuable jewel would have spoken of nothing else after it vanished, yet Lady Edith seemed far more frightened by the mention of Harold Turner than by the theft itself. Lady Edith's face slowly lost color. Miss Marple continued quietly, because Harold Turner was never merely a groundskeeper. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Inspector Vale stepped forward. Who was he? Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon Lady Edith. He was her husband. The words struck the room like thunder. One of the women gasped aloud. Colonel Hastings nearly dropped his pup entirely. Miss Marple explained calmly, while rain drifted softly against the manor windows. Years earlier, before marrying wealthy Sir Richard Carrington, Lady Edith had secretly married Harold Turner. The marriage had been hidden carefully once Sir Richard entered her life, with money, status, and Briarley Manor itself. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. Harold returned months ago, demanding money in exchange for silence. Lionel Graves, the family solicitor, discovered the truth soon afterwards and began blackmailing Lady Edith himself. Money first, then the sapphire. He intended to leave with the jewel after the blackout, Miss Marple said quietly, but greed made him careless. Inspector Vale nodded slowly now, beginning to see it himself. Graves went to the silk room late last night, demanding more money, Miss Marple continued. Lady Edith followed him there. They argued. He threatened exposure again, and in panic, her voice softened, she grabbed the silk cord. Nobody moved. Lady Edith stared into the fireplace with empty eyes. "I didn't mean," she whispered weakly. "I only wanted him to stop talking." But fear and desperation make dangerous companions. Miss Marple looked sadly toward the floor. Afterwards, she pinned the sapphire to his body to make the murder appear connected to the theft. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Then Lady Edith gave a strange little laugh, thin, hollow, the sound of someone finally too exhausted to keep pretending. Outside, the storm had finally begun to fade. Pale morning light crept slowly across the windows of Briarley Manor, though the house itself still felt cold and heavy with secrets. Inspector Vale stepped quietly toward Lady Edith, while the guests looked away in discomfort. No one wished to witness the end of grandeur. But endings come all the same. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and glanced once toward the upper corridor leading to the silk room. Funny thing about old houses, the walls remember everything. The lies, the fear, the footsteps in the dark. And somewhere deep within Briarley Manor, a door creaked softly open all by itself, as though the house still had one last secret left to whisper. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and return for the next case, because somewhere, in another quiet English village, somebody is already planning their next terrible mistake.